For those of you who are new, welcome. Just as a reminder, turn off your mics while you're not talking. There's two ways to ask questions. One is through the chat room, and you can write your questions, or two, you can simply put your mic on and ask to be recognized. And I think we'll have vibrant discussions during the reading of this book, so I'm excited. So, welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. This is the beginning of a new session of the virtual reading group. Interestingly enough, the virtual reading group's been going on, I think now for almost 3 or 4 years. I actually don't even remember when we started. And when we first started, I think the first test episode was reading Eichmann in Jerusalem, but we haven't come back to it since then, which is potentially surprising. It's in many ways Arendt's best known book. It's certainly the most controversial book. It's the book that many people, when you go out to a dinner party and you say you run the Hannah Arendt Center and people say who, you say, oh, have you heard of The Banality of Evil? And then people usually say, oh, of course. It's the book she's most known for and identified with, which doesn't mean it's her best book. Some people would say that it's certainly not. I actually think it's quite a wonderful book. I teach it quite regularly. I was for a while writing a book on the book and its controversy, but decided not to do that in the end. So what I want to say at the outset is that this book will be controversial. A lot of people, it has been controversial. Arendt herself thought that most of the controversy came from people not reading the book closely, from paying attention to what a couple of people said about it who hadn't read it but picked out sentences or phrases that she thought were inflammatory, but that the book itself she thought was not. We'll have to make our own decisions. So the way I think we'll proceed is we'll read it carefully as a book and try and understand Arendt's point of view, and there's a lot in the book that opens up interesting moral and political debate, which we'll get into. And then I will certainly give people plenty of leeway to offer either criticisms of the book or if the case may be, defenses of it. We shouldn't treat it as in any kind of a holy grail. I think there's a couple things to remind ourselves of. One is the book was written, as she says, as a trial report for the New Yorker magazine. She actually asked if she could cover it for them. As many of you know, she was born in Germany, was arrested in 1933 doing research in the Prussian State Library for the Zionists, was let out, escaped, was in France, escaped from a camp in Gurs, France, and came to the United States, where she wrote her first big book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which we've read in this group and we'll probably read again at some point. And what she said in the letter she wrote to the New Yorker was, I would not forgive myself if I didn't go and look at one of these monsters in the face. How could I not try and understand and encounter someone who actually was able to be part of the Holocaust and the final solution? And so she wrote it for the New Yorker, and I think it's important for us to remember that it's written for a public audience. As with many of the things Arendt wrote for a public audience, there's a huge divergence between the way it's understood often in a quick read and the deeper reading that knows what she's actually referring to based on other works that she's written or just other philosophical or historical ideas. And so one of our challenges will be to both read it as a piece of journalism, but also think about how it fits in with larger philosophical and historical texts and points. Um, with that said, let me jump in. The first chapter, which we read for today, is called "The House of Justice." Um, uh, in Hebrew, the way they opened the trial every day was with the claim, and I don't claim to pronounce Hebrew well, Beth Hamishpath, and the House of Justice, and she begins the book with a chapter on the House of Justice, I think for very particular reasons. In many ways, the core critique she has of the trial, and one that hasn't been so controversial until recently, is that the judges wanted to do justice. Moshe Landau, who's the head judge, she thinks very highly of, and she praises throughout this book. But she says the prosecutors, Gideon Hausner, and she thinks his master, Ben Gurion, she says we're less interested in justice and more interested in what she calls a show trial. This aspect of her argument, that the trial and of Eichmann was really not about, was actually about two different things. As a trial, it was about justice and trying to do justice to the defendant, give him a fair trial and give him punishment that he deserves. And on the other hand, it was being used by some people in the Israeli government, in her opinion, to teach a new generation of Israelis about the Holocaust, because this is 1961 when the trial's happening, and you're 20 years past this, and a lot of young people in Israel don't know the history of the Holocaust, don't know it well. We also have to remember that in 1961, the Holocaust amongst survivors was still something not talked about so much. This is, I think, one of the huge subtexts of both her book and many of the critics of it, especially the more recent critics of it. And I'm thinking here of someone like Deborah Lipstadt. In many ways, Deborah Lipstadt's main criticism of this book is that Hannah Arendt misunderstood the very purpose of the trial. The trial wasn't, in Lipstadt's mind, to do justice to Adolf Eichmann, who she thinks was without a doubt guilty. The trial was to help heal and give the survivors a chance to revisit and talk about a traumatic event which for the last 20 years they had largely been silent about, and to bring that event into the narrative of the Israeli state. And so Lipstadt argues Arendt just misunderstands the point of the trial. The trial is really not about justice. It's about state building and about creating a narrative and about teaching the world about the dangers of anti-Semitism. I think that's an important critique, and it's one we can discuss. But for Arendt, starting the book with a chapter called "The House of Justice" is a very clear statement on her part about what a trial like this should be, and where the trial was successful and where it was not. Where it was successful was with the judges. So she has great praise for Moshe Landau, who she says, like everybody else in the room, or most of them, spoke German, because most of them were German refugees, or many of them. And he spoke German to the witness. He didn't wait for the translations. And she says this, of course, was evidence of his remarkable independence of current public opinion in Israel, on page 4. The judges, she says, strove mightily to make the trial a serious trial about justice. On the other hand, she has almost nothing but scorn for the prosecutor, Gideon Hausner, who she says basically is trying to turn Eichmann into a tool for his own purposes and for Ben-Gurion's purposes to build the state of Israel. You can see it when she says on page 6, she quotes Hausner saying, "If we shall charge Eichmann also with crimes against non-Jews, this is not because he committed them, but surprisingly because we make no ethnic distinctions." And she's like, this is crazy. She thinks this statement by Hausner, to claim that they make no ethnic distinctions. Of course, Israel itself is a Jewish state. How can they say they don't make ethnic distinctions? But more so than that, they have to remind people that they're not trying him only as a Jew. And she compares this with the Nuremberg trials, where people were tried for crimes against humanity. And so she actually, at the end of the book, will find she's going to defend the idea of charging him with crimes against the Jewish people. But she thinks he should also be charged against crimes against humanity. She also says that the case was built upon what Jews had suffered, not on what Eichmann had done. And this is a big part of her critique of the trial. For her, and this is on page 6, this is in many ways her statement of what justice is. She says, "Justice demands that the accused be prosecuted. Not that the accused be used as a tool for other means, but he be prosecuted for what he or she has done." She says, "Justice insists on the importance of Adolf Eichmann, and justice proves to be a much sterner master than Ben-Gurion. Justice demands seclusion." Ben-Gurion was holding press conferences. He was making Hausner was making press conferences, and she finds, and he was, again, using Eichmann as sort of a tool to teach, and Arendt was very critical of this approach. On page 8, she says, as all the lessons that Hausner tried to teach piled up, so the lessons include that there was eternal anti-Semitism, that the Jews didn't resist, that the Warsaw Ghetto was ignored. She says, as all these things were talked about, and as we heard hours and days and days and days of survivor testimony, much of which had nothing to do with Eichmann, she says, Eichmann himself became paler and more ghost-like. And the trial became not about him, but about what had happened to the Jews. And I should say, this is an argument that is still going on in criminal law debates today about whether a criminal trial should be about the guilt of the accused or about making the victims feel better. And there's this whole victims' rights movement in criminal law, which has tried to move the trial ever more towards concerning the victim. And Arendt is clearly quite resistant to that move as a matter of justice. So the first 10 pages are really about this idea of justice and the way in which the court and the prosecutor worked, in a sense, to make the trial not about justice, and how the judges tried to keep it about justice. The second part of the text is where she talks about one of the impacts that the trial had, which is that it helped to ferret out numerous Nazis in Germany who had been living in Germany and Austria and other related countries openly, freely, not by assumed names since the war, even though what they had done, the crimes they had committed, had been widely publicized and published in magazines and journals. And so she thinks that one of the good effects of the trial is that it began the process of Germany beginning to confront its Nazi past. And she lists a number of people who were then put on trial. Most of them, though, were given very, very light sentences. So people who had killed thousands of Jews were put in jail for 2 years. And Arendt does not think much of this as a matter of justice. And so she is quite critical of the the way Germany has reacted to the history of the Holocaust, saying that most Germans were quite content to allow mass murderers to continue to live and operate in their society without anything being done about it. And she says on page 16. The third, I would say, point of this first chapter on the House of Justice concerns the question of extradition. Leading up to the trial, one of the biggest questions was whether it was right for Eichmann to be tried in Israel by Jews. Many people in the human rights community thought he should be tried either in an international court or in a German court because his crimes were committed largely in Germany, or at least in Europe, not in Israel. Arendt, at the end of the book, will defend the right of Israel to hold the trial. And one of her reasons, which she talks about here, is that Germany, the last thing Germany wanted was to extradite Eichmann to Germany and put him on trial there, primarily because they were afraid he might be acquitted. The one German who really worked to have Eichmann extradited was the Berlin prosecutor Fritz Bauer, who was Jewish. But Arendt says on page 17 that his feelings were the feelings of a German Jew, not of the German people. Finally, the last point that she really brings up in this opening chapter is the question of collective guilt, or the complicity of all, which is a question and an idea that she talks about in many of her books, and is one that her opinion on is quite controversial but well thought out, I think. The question was asked by the Frankfurter Rundschau, why so many people who must have known that these Germans were living in Germany, these Nazis were living in Germany, kept silent. And the answer that they gave, and that she thinks is right, is because they felt themselves to be incriminated. They felt themselves guilty. And so this raises the question of collective guilt. For her, the logic of the Eichmann trial, in many ways, that Gideon Hausner put forward, is a logic of collective guilt, namely that all German officers and authorities who were involved in the final solution are guilty of it. She's then critical of the fact that the court refused to name names of current German politicians who were involved in the Nazi regime, including the one she talks about, Hans Globke, who, as the Ministerialrat of the Interior during the Nazi period, among other things, had the brilliant idea of compelling all German Jews of taking the middle names of Israel or Sarah. And she suggests that there may have been a secret deal to keep Globke out of the trial between Adenauer and Ben-Gurion. I'm going to stop there and just see where you guys are at, what kind of questions you have. Let me say, again, this is the opening chapter. It's largely table setting, and yet there are some weighty issues that she's already brought up. Primarily this question about, should the trial have been about justice, right? Should a trial like this be a political, and it is a political trial. I don't think you can argue that it's not. And what she's saying is that insofar it was a political trial, it should be still about justice. It shouldn't be a show trial. It shouldn't have political aims outside of doing justice.
Roger?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just say something? So I was young then, but I was in Israel at the time of the trial, and my sister was one of the stenographers that she describes sitting there. And I know that because I came from a German Jewish family, that Gideon Hausner was perceived primarily as Ben-Gurion's man. And it wasn't really that she didn't seem to be so, or the community at large was not negative about him as much as they were very reluctant to have this as a sort of demonstration of how miserable how badly we are treated, et cetera, et cetera. And that was Ben-Gurion's attempt to create a play. And she writes about Ben-Gurion in other contexts as well, so she's not particularly fond of him. I just wanted to say that it wasn't necessarily Gideon himself, but his role as Ben-Gurion's henchman, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's the role he played during the trial. And she calls him someone who serves Ben Gurion as his master, not justice, which is, I think, a fairly strong criticism of a prosecutor. Her problem with Ben Gurion is manyfold. She doesn't like the way he winks at the audience, the way he stares at the audience. He doesn't like the fact that he's holding press conferences. I mean, we all know that prosecutors don't usually hold press conferences during a criminal trial. She doesn't like the fact that he grandstanded. She obviously clearly had some people would say a class issue with him. She saw him as a lower class, not as someone who handled this as the judges did, which is with some sort of detachment. Not detachment, because the judges were not detached, but with a commitment to justice and not simply to anger and revenge. And I think she saw Hausner as poisoning the trial element. Now, again, some people would say that's what he should have done, but I think it's clear that's where her prejudices lie, and I think we should be trying to understand them, and I'm happy to hear people's views on them. Do you remember? I don't know, Defta. Do you remember talking to you said your grandmother was a stenographer? Your mother? Who was it?
My sister was
Your
the
sister.
stenographer at the trial. My sister was, just so that you can understand that I'm really quite young, she's
Yes.
8 years older than I am. But at the time, she was a stenographer. She also spoke German because my father came from Berlin.
Right.
So we were part of that community. And Gideon Hausner was among the people that we knew and actually liked. But none of us liked his boss, Ben-Gurion.
So did your sister ever read Hannah Arendt's book or articles, and I wonder what she thought of it?
No, I don't think she did. I mean, I think that, and when you're doing that job, apparently, you don't really think about the contents. You're so, you're so concentrated on each word. So
Yeah.
I think that it's a whole different, it's more technical than intellectual.
Yeah. So, I mean, in this, as we go through this book, we're going to deal with some of the main controversies that come up. So one is this question of whether Eichmann is evil or banally evil. And another is her view of the Jews who collaborated with the Nazis during the roundup of people and in the camps. But those aren't too much addressed in this first chapter. Well, there is one place where the question of collaboration is addressed, and we will talk about that. But the main controversy, I think, here in this chapter is this very strong claim she makes about the nature of justice and legal justice, that if you're going to do justice to someone, even someone like Eichmann, you have to, in some sense, detach yourself from the anger, the vengeful emotions, and seek to understand him and ask the question of, did he do what he's accused of doing? And treat that as a matter of legal justice. And she thinks Hausner didn't do that. Interestingly enough, at the end of this book, we will see her argue that, in some sense, the mistake that the judges made was that they understood this too much as a legal trial and not as a political trial. But she's going to think of it as a political trial in a very different sense than Gideon Hausner did. She's going to think of it as a political trial where you have to simply say what you did was horrifically wrong and you should be killed for it, even though you didn't break a law. And this is the problem that she has with Eichmann and with the trial of Eichmann is you try and create a legal process to put him on trial, and yet what law did he break? And she talks about how the prosecutors tried to figure out a law he broke, and in the end, they have a hard time doing so in any meaningful way. And we'll get there when we read the last two chapters of the book. But I'm wondering what people think about her basic claim that a trial, even a trial of someone like Adolf Eichmann, should be a trial governed by justice. Is she right?
Roger?
Yeah.
Hi, it's Margaret. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was really struck reading this that I guess my first response on pages 6 and 7 was that's what it often is. And that, just as there are different styles in pursuing different professions. There are different kinds of college professors. There are different kinds of trial lawyers. And what she is describing in the prosecuting litigator is a very standard type of lawyer. And the thing that's odd about it, and interesting to your point just now, is that the showmanship, dare I say, something we might see in this country now on our televisions, is usually accentuated when one has less evidence. And that it is easy to be much more sober and serious and in pursuit of a loftier goal because it's clear, concrete, documentary, and, spoken evidence. But winks at the audience and, all that kind of showmanship is by no means unusual. And so it was strange because to me that seemed very out of touch with how litigation does work and how I thought to myself, how would a trial of this place at this time not be a show trial? But then I thought, well, but he makes a very, very, very good point, very pointed point about not focusing on the deeds, but rather the concomitant suffering. So in one sense, she's sort of not focused on the actualities of the trial practice, and in another sense, she really is. And the two comments seem to contradict each other, which I thought was sort of interesting.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that there's different times when a show trial becomes a show trial. One is, as you said, when you don't have a lot of evidence. But another is when you want to prove a point that is not the same as whether a person did it or not. In a sense, that's almost irrelevant. I mean, I think her worry, and I think her claim is that, I mean, it's clear that Eichmann was involved in the final solution. No one ever has any doubt about that. He admits that. The real question is whether he committed a crime in doing so, and what that crime is, and what his punishment should be.
I think what
she's saying is that Israel didn't really care. I mean, Hausner didn't really care too much about that. His goal was something quite different. Go ahead. Who wanted to say something?
I just wanted to interject one sec, just to follow up. That's exactly why the second point I made struck me so much, because her point that there was not a focus on what he had done was exactly what sort of pulled Roger the conversation away from that larger issue. If that makes any sense.
Suzanne, did you want to say something?
I did want to. So this is Theodora Teddy. I'll go back to your original question that started this thread, and it had to do with justice. and the nature of justice, or a definition of justice. We think of justice as having often a single definition, but in fact, we know.
Teddy, I think we lost. I'm not sure if other people did too, but I lost you.
May I step in the meanwhile?
Yeah, come on in. Come on in.
Yeah, thank you. I always read this book with the concern about understanding what Arendt approaches as justice, and I do so. I'm not sure whether I have been successful in reaching the right understanding, but I try to get help from both the Life of the Mind, where she talks about the way we relate to our conscience and get into dialogue with that, and also to lying and politics. And with that help, I kind of read her concern of not totally focusing on victimhood, of not basing justice on unchosen identities like ethnicity and race, ethnicity and religion, sorry for that, and on not basing justice just on the deeds of one person, on not basing justice on personalism, with a view to making sure that justice does not turn into a process of revenge taking. That is why I might kind of question what you said, Roger, actually, about the victims' rights. I don't think that she's putting aside the victim rights, but she is just warning us to be about the risks of putting all the burden on just one person as the radical evil, as the representative of radical evil, for all the deeds against humanity, and also for all the monstrous deeds against the Jews during the Nazi regime. That is what I just wanted to say about
Yeah, no,
justice.
I think there's some really important points in there, and but I wanna, and I think it's important to say one or two things about it. One is, she doesn't want to say that, I think she thinks it ludicrous to say that the one person, Adolf Eichmann, is responsible for the entire Holocaust.
No,
If that's
she
what you were
doesn't
saying.
say so. Is it? It's not what I was saying. It was. Can I intervene?
Okay.
What I was saying is that, as far as my reading goes, the way I understand her caution in taking Eichmann as the radical evil, as turning him into a showcase of radical evil, would risk the silent, would risk the would risk us to. I'm sorry, I cannot put it in words. Would risk the other people with Nazi past to get away with their accomplice or complacency in the atrocities against the Jews. That's what I was trying to say. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I wanted to add, though, that she does believe that all people who actually committed crimes should be punished. In the end, she's going to come out and say Eichmann should be killed. She thinks he should be killed for what he did. By the same token, these many Germans who were put on trial by the state of Germany in the 1960s and given light sentences, she found that scandalous. She thought they should be killed. And she's going to make an argument at the end of the book about why, right? Which is not that they broke the law, but that they did something so horrific and participated in something so horrific that even though it was legal under the Nazi rules at that time, we can't reconcile with a world in which things like that happen. And we have to politically, not legally, politically say to them, we can't live in a world in which we don't erase people like you from it, not because of you, but because of what you've done. And that's going to be a very controversial and important claim that she's going to make at the very end of the book, and we'll get there. But I want to just be clear that she thinks that people like Eichmann and like Globka and like many of these criminals should have been and should be prosecuted and should be killed. She thinks that's the only way to address this, and we'll get into an argument about the death penalty when we talk about that later in the book, because she's going to say, in this particular instance, the only real punishment is death.
Roger,
So
when we talk about justice and her concept of justice, there's a bad noise. What is that?
Somebody's got it. I know somebody's mic is on, so if we could turn it off. I don't know, some feedback.
So what I wanted to say was that at the time that this trial was going, there was, for Hannah Arendt, there was a lot of controversy with regard to the Ben-Gurion and the sort of political nationalism that was developing in Israel. And when we read this book, we're reading it in English in a context that is totally outside of that. So we're dealing with concepts that may be universal and may be eternal, and that would be, what is justice and can there be justice? But at the time that she was writing this, from the very myopic perspective of an Israeli, I know that to her, the staging of this trial, the kidnapping, the staging of this trial was intentional to present to the world the justification of militant Zionism. And so, there is that angle that we're not seeing. It's not just a question of whether Jews ethnically should be labeled as Jews when they determine the fate of Eichmann, because that's not neutral. That's not unbiased. Is that really justice? But that Ben-Gurion and his cohorts wanted the world to see this. They were very eager to say, see, that's why we need to fight, tooth and nail to have this country, and we will develop it the way that militant Zionism wants to develop it. And I think that's not visible to people reading it outside of that context. So I'll shut up about it, but it's very meaningful to me.
No, I think when I brought
Can we
up,
jump in?
Yeah, I'm going to let you jump in a sec. I'm just going to say, when I brought up Deborah Lipstadt, that's her point, right? And that's her critique of Arendt, that Arendt, in a sense, ignored that aspect of the trial, which was important, that it was about Israeli state building and about doing justice to the survivors. I'm going to let Peter jump in. He's been waiting.
Thanks. And it's all fascinating. This is such a great book, and I'm thrilled to be part of this. I guess there's a question of justice writ small and writ large, micro and macro type justice. So within the context of the trial, I guess a trial court is a contrivance that we do to keep from just accusing somebody willy-nilly and stringing them up very quickly. Instead, we think we've achieved civilization by creating this space called a courtroom and making sure that the evidence is as accurate as possible, and we have the right person, and that person will then get some kind of societal response to if they're found guilty, to the wounds they've created. Again, in this particular case, it's not clear to me what possible punishment could be commensurate with the crime in any of these cases. But it seems to me this is in the larger justice question, and going to Daphne, is that your name? Daphne's points, is that, yes, the context is this, if it is Zionistic militancy or nationalism, is also in a larger context of a world that could care less about Jewish thoughts and Jewish positions on anything. And it's compensatory to some extent. If all the series of crimes that were dealt with in Nazi Germany are dealt with in a just way, namely the evidence is put forward, the person is found guilty, and then they're given 2 years in response to killing 40,000, then isn't it appropriate for Israel to take a different stance to say, you know what, you're not going to forget the victims, you're not going to forget the size of the suffering, and Eichmann in one way is important because he represents something bigger, but in another way he's meaningless, because we're going to tell you the story that isn't being told in German courts and in other courts around the world. And it wasn't Jews who tried him, it was prosecutors who tried him, who happened to be Jewish, and we're not going to let you call them Jewish prosecutors. And I know you're shaking your head, but at the end of the day, the question of justice is the question, not what Arendt means or doesn't mean, although, of course, we're looking at the book. But I'm hoping we're looking at the book for the sake of thinking about things like justice. And I don't think it's as simple as just as Zionistic militancy is the reason this went right or left or whatever direction you want to call it.
No, I think
context is, there are many contexts things can be taken in.
that's right, Peter. And I would say this. Can you turn your mic off so I don't?
No, sorry, yeah.
Feedback. The question of justice as sort of a universal, if there is such a thing, what is justice? Is I'm not sure there's an answer to that. My first book was about the changing ideas of justice throughout in modern eras. So there's many different ideas, but Arendt takes a very particular view of justice, right? Which is that justice has to be, at least in the law and in criminal law, has to be about whether the accused pridefully broke the law, pridefully put themselves and their personal desires and wants above the law. So a criminal in criminal theory, in Western criminal theory, a criminal is one who acts out of pride, hubris, and takes upon themselves the right to do which is not allowed. And punishment doesn't actually concern the victim. It simply concerns bringing their soul back to justice, back to the right. So poiena, the root of punishment, is pain. And the premise of criminal law is that you suffer pain for what you have done, and the pain will break your hard heart and make you see that you were wrong so that you repent and come back to the law, come back to the right path. That's sort of classical legal theory that has its final sort of heyday in Hegelian legal thought. And Arendt is, for better or worse, representing that view of legal justice and of punishment. What I think Peter is bringing up, and it's the part that others have brought up that I was trying to sort of say with Deborah Lipstadt and others, is that there are other views of justice. And one of them is that victims, or those who don't have the power to have their stories told or heard, need the legal system to, in a sense, speak for them and give them voice and power. And that's become a widespread movement against the traditional, the traditional view of justice that I just outlined, which is Arendt's view, is deeply influenced by both Greek and Christian thought, as you can hear. I mean, the idea of hubris, pride, it's the first sin of Christianity. And there's a lot of people who say, look, in a post-religious world where we don't believe in, your soul being brought back to truth or to God, that's not what law should be about. That's not what punishment should be about. It should be doing justice to the victims. And Arendt is clearly arguing against that sort of modern understanding of justice. And I think it's, we can all have our opinions. I'm happy to hear your thoughts on it. But there is in the classical legal sense, she's clearly on good grounds.
The two
Roger,
aren't mutually.
I think that in most of her writing,
Hold on, let's let some people join in. Who I know there's some people who wanted to say things that haven't spoken yet. So let me just let some people in.
Roger, could I make 2 points?
Yeah.
The first, I want to mention how I appreciated your commentary at the beginning, emphasizing the fact that this book, based on the articles, was written for the New Yorker, which is a popular but a pretty good popular magazine. And so the criticism you see in some cases about whether she was flippant or the tone wasn't right it was right for that particular kind of publication, maybe not for a serious journal. And I found reading it, I felt more closer to her than with some of her other writings, which are much more dense and stuff. And the second point, I guess, based on what the gentleman just said before, is the fact that the thing you're talking about is so horrible. The Holocaust was so horrible that the things were so bad that you're in a zone of relativity, that no common understanding of things like justice, if you understand what I'm saying. It's so far beyond what normal reasoning would help you with, that we can't apologize that nobody got it exactly right. That's what I thought. That was my feeling anyway. It's so bad. I mean, we can't even comprehend it now. I can't. Every time I read additional stuff, I get crazy about it.
Thanks, Patrick. I know Peter and Daphne both wanted to respond, so why don't Peter and then Daphne, you guys can respond?
Thanks. I just don't want to suggest that I was saying that it's one or the other, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive. But certainly the ways in which a trial is conducted matter, and it's part of the statement about who we are as a society that it's done in as objective a way as possible. And so it's clear it was also meant to have the state prosecute as opposed to the injured, because the injured would have emotions racing through them, and they may not conduct the trial in the way a quote-unquote dispassionate state would. That a state would be dispassionate in such a case seems to be a little bit of a problem for me looking at something like this. It's curious that would be the case, and I think that was the corrective meant to take place with victim voice, especially in the case where a trial tends to focus so much on the guilty or the alleged guilty, and in doing so makes the guilty the star, the alleged the defendant. He's definitely a defendant. He's alleged of the crimes. That makes him the star of the show and leaves the victims out, especially in a case where they're dead. So victims' rights was a chance for families to at least represent the voice of the dead in such a trial. And I think also within the discipline of justice, fine, I understand the critique that it should be by those rules, but justice in the societal stand looks to mend not just the perpetrator, but also the society that's felt an injury. And maybe it can be satisfied to know, oh, good, he's going on the up and up from here on in. But I think there's also wounds that have to be addressed, and part of that in this trial, I think, was a statement. It's a pedagogic place, the trial, and it's stating the values of the society by conducting itself in a number of different possible ways, and I wonder if this wasn't the right mix of the two.
Hi, I was wondering if I can make a comment.
Yeah,
I wanted to weigh in too at some point.
So I thought there were two things that were interesting. One is that I feel like it's interesting to consider the precedent that was set by the Nuremberg trials. And once international court was disbanded, who was really the next likely people to try these criminals who needed to be tried, but there was no overwhelming international court left. And I think Israel was the most obvious place to try them, especially if they weren't going to be extradited to Germany. I also think it's really important to consider the role that Eichmann specifically played in the Holocaust. He wasn't holding the gun, but rather he was administrative. And that I think the importance of this trial was not just demonstrating like another Nazi at a concentration camp, but rather people who have roles within the administration allowing these kinds of things to happen through paperwork effectively, and what we would consider regular governmental roles were equally culpable and also were responsible, and his trial specifically was important for that reason.
Thanks. I think that's right. I mean, one of the things we'll be talking a lot about over the next few months reading this book is whether Eichmann was a bureaucrat and what that means, and B, the responsibility of bureaucrats. I think this, just to give you a little, foresight. One of the criticisms of the book is that some people say Arendt calls Eichmann just a bureaucrat, and therefore that's why she says he's banal. That's definitely not the case, and that's one of those criticisms that I hope if you read the book you'll be disabused of. Arendt, first of all, doesn't think he's just a bureaucrat. She thinks he's someone who actively worked to implement and even expand the orders he was given, and she's pretty clear that he was he was not simply following orders. He was also quite good at improvising and taking those orders to another level. And secondly, she thinks that there is a deep responsibility for bureaucrats as well as people like Eichmann for what they have done, and that they can't simply say, well, I was just pushing this paper or doing this. She thinks that there is a deep responsibility and complicity amongst the administrative class, as Julie just said. So those will be issues that will come up a lot as we read this book, and it's good to have them on the table.
I think that the book is not just about whether the concept of justice applies to this trial. So I think that one of the issues that we can discuss is then the concept of justice that has nothing to do with what Hannah Arendt is putting forth. But I think that Hannah Arendt in this context is explaining the complexity of making justice appear in a context that is so completely partial or not impartial. There's no way that anybody attending that trial, participating in that trial, prosecuting the trial, or judging the trial could have been impartial. And in a sense, that is something that's really crucial in her analysis, I think, of the Eichmann trial. Whether it's true and it applies in other issues of trials of justice, that's a whole different story. But in this particular case, nobody in that courtroom was unbiased.
Could I say
Just
something?
yes, Susan, go ahead.
You want
No.
to say something first?
I was going to just add to one part of Julie Wood's comment that I had forgotten because I was reading what she'd written, which is that the idea of crimes against humanity, she asked what part it plays in this trial, and was Israel the only country that could continue to try people for these crimes? So the answer to the second part is no. First of all, there could have been an international tribunal, which is what some people thought. And some people even argued for an international tribunal in Israel, but one that would be like the Nuremberg tribunal, an international court. Secondly, crimes against humanity will play a role in the final decision. The final verdict that the court hands down has different criteria. There's a number of the decisions are about crimes against the Jewish people. Then some of them are against the crimes against humanity, and then some are about his membership in particular organizations. And we'll see that at the very end, the court actually finds him guilty almost of none of those, at least the trial court, but of aiding and abetting mass murder. And these we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk about crimes against humanity and the crimes against the Jewish people and the relation between them. It's going to be a very important aspect of Arendt's arguments. So who did I interrupt? I'm sorry.
Susan, you didn't interrupt. I didn't get started yet. I just wanted to sort of share my, emotional experience to reading the intro and this first chapter. I mean, I haven't read the book in probably 30 years or more. And I have to say, I've been really distraught since reading it. I felt from the very, very first paragraph, in terms of her description of the court and this tone of hers, that was kind of not just ironic, but kind of arch. Maybe that's the word. And that this to me was an odd introduction to the whole book, which I haven't, reread yet. But that I think, I wonder whether or not the violent reaction of many people, particularly Jewish Americans, American Jews, to her argument wasn't made easier by her starting where she did. So that in this first chapter, there's this kind of, and it's hard for me to be really calm. I feel very emotional about this and not particularly academic, frankly. That her sort of description of the courtroom, of the players, of the allegedly nefarious deeds of some of the Jews and their passivity. It just seems to me like a very odd place to start, given the complexity of her ensuing argument, that it's a turnoff. It makes you feel very defensive. So she doesn't really start. I just wonder why she chose to start that way. And, in her, snobbery, I guess you could put it, or prejudice against Eastern European Jews versus the German Jews, the more intellectuals, is also disturbing, obviously. But it just seems to me tactically, I just wonder why she chose to start this way. It's very provocative and disturbing. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there for whatever.
I think that's an excellent point, Susan. And I'll offer at least my answer to it, which I'm happy to hear people's view on, which is she wanted to immediately establish the tone of this book, right? In a way, this book is about justice. And I will say at the end of the book, the very end of the book, she's going to issue her judgment of Eichmann, right? And we'll spend a lot of time on that. Actually, if you don't mind, let's just read it, because I think it's something we should all have in our heads. It's on page 277. It begins, and near the bottom of the page, she's citing Yosel Rogat, who's a great legal scholar. And she says, and yet I think it is undeniable that it was precisely on the ground of these long-forgotten propositions, and she's talking here about revenge and the idea that an eye for an eye and that the earth screams out for justice. So it's on the idea of these long-forgotten propositions that Eichmann was brought to justice to begin with, and that they were, in fact, the supreme justification for the death penalty. Because he had been implicated and had played a central role in an enterprise whose open purpose was to eliminate forever certain races from the surface of the earth, he had to be eliminated. And if it is true that justice must not only be done, but must be seen to be done, then the justice of what was done in Jerusalem would have emerged to be seen by all, if the judges had dared to address their defendant in something like the following terms. So now here is Arendt's verdict. This is what she thinks the judges should have dared to say. You admitted that the crime committed against the Jewish people during the war was the greatest crime in recorded history. And you admitted your role in it. But you said you had never acted from base motives, that you had never had any inclination to kill anybody, that you had never hated Jews, and that still you could not have acted otherwise, and that you did not feel guilty. We find this difficult, though not altogether impossible, to believe. There is some, though not very much, evidence against you in the matter of motivation and conscience that could be proved beyond reasonable doubt. You also said that your role in the final solution was an accident, and that almost anybody could have taken your place, namely that he's a bureaucrat. So that potentially all Germans are equally guilty. What you meant to say was that where all, or almost all, are guilty, nobody is. This is indeed a quite common conclusion, and one we are not willing to grant you. And if you don't understand our objection, we would recommend to your attention the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, two neighboring cities in the Bible, which were destroyed by fire from heaven because all the people in them had become equally guilty. This, incidentally, has nothing to do with the newfangled notion of collective guilt, according to which people supposedly are guilty of or feel guilty about things done in their name, but not by them, things in which they did not participate and from which they did not profit. In other words, guilt and innocence before the law are of an objective nature, And even if 80 million Germans had done as you did, this would not have been an excuse for you. Namely, they should all be killed. Luckily, we don't have to go that far. You yourself claim not the actuality, but only the potentiality of equal guilt on the part of all who lived in the state. And no matter through what accidents of exterior or interior circumstances you were pushed onto the road of becoming a criminal, there is an abyss between the actuality of what you did and the potentiality of what others might have done. We are concerned here only with what you did, and not with the possible non-criminal nature of your inner life and of your motives, or with the criminal potentialities of those around you. You told your story in terms of a hard luck story, and knowing the circumstances, we are, up to a point, willing to grant you, under the more favorable circumstances, it is highly unlikely that you would have ever come before us or before any other criminal court if it had not been for the German state and the Holocaust. Let us assume, for the sake of argument, that it was nothing more than misfortune that made you a willing instrument in the organization of mass murder. There still remains the fact that you have carried out and therefore actively supported a policy of mass murder. For politics is not like the nursery. In politics, obedience and support are the same. That's one of the key lines here, and we'll spend a lot of time parsing this as well. In politics, obedience and support are the same. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share the earth with you. This is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang. So why did I read this long judgment of hers in response to what I think Susan had said? It's because, on the one hand, I think Susan's right. At the beginning of the book, Arendt tries to set up and say, look, we are going to do justice. And justice means we're objective, we hold back our feelings, we hold back our emotions. And so I'm going to describe to you the courtroom, I'm going to describe to you the table, I'm going to describe to you what the room looks like and what the people look like and things like that. And it is no doubt that I think there's a lot of people for whom, how are you going to write a book about Adolf Eichmann and start off in this really objectively dry way? And I think her answer is because that's what justice demands. Justice demands that we take our feelings out, that we seclude ourselves from feelings and from emotions and from the world. And yet, as we're going to see at the end of the book, justice doesn't mean that we don't make a strong judgment. But what's going to allow that judgment, what's going to allow us to make that judgment, is that we judge Eichmann himself, and we take him seriously. And so she's really drawing, I think, in these opening pages, a very stark contrast with the way the trial was handled, as Peter and Daphne said, for a whole host of good reasons in Israel, or good reasons for the state of Israel, that they wanted this to be a teaching moment. They wanted this to be an expression of Jewish power and Jewish statehood, and they wanted to teach about the crimes that the Jews had suffered. But Arendt is trying to set herself up and say, if we're going to judge you and we're going to kill you, because that's what I think we should do, and I think she knew that before the trial, we have to take you seriously. And that's a very strong claim on her part. So I don't know if that makes sense to you, Susan. I'm not saying it.
Let me put it this way. I mean, it makes sense, but I guess I'm wondering whether or not, if part of her purpose is, in the end, to share her perspective and her observation, whether or not, A, it would have been more effective had she started out, as many books do, with the conclusion that they're finally going to reach, and then backtrack. So in a way, I'm talking, it's a sort of, in a way, a strategic point. I also think the point about, I mean, this being a political trial, I mean, this is not dissimilar to the trials, some of which I was involved in, in the late 60s and 70s, where, we strove to make trials political in the sense of bringing in the broader context, of criminal justice and racism and slavery and the oppression of, African Americans, because we felt it was relevant to what the case was about. So I think the context, making it politicizing a trial, is not unusual. It doesn't happen all the time. So, I guess I just feel like, yeah, all of that could happen, should happen, and she should elaborate on it. But given the uproar that her book caused, I think I'm just struck in the beginning whether or not she would have been better understood. Let's put it that way. Perhaps. I'm not really clear yet about her whole message, but whether she might have been better understood in terms of what she was trying to argue had she, started differently. That's all.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Mark. I'm not quite sure what you meant when you said talked about taking Hannah Arendt taking Eichmann seriously. Was that sort of a progression through the trial, or is that something that she indicated right away at the beginning, and that was the reason for her tone? I didn't quite get that.
Well, I think one of the reasons she wrote to the New Yorker and said she wanted to cover this trial is she wanted to see these people in the face, she said, to look at them in the face. She wanted to try and understand who they were. And so she thinks that to do justice means to judge Eichmann for what he did. And part of that means taking him seriously. In the next chapter that we're going to read for next week, which is called The Accused, it's about Eichmann. And, if Susan is upset about this chapter, right, and I understand why she is, the fact that the second chapter is about Eichmann is another thing that as a strategy, if Arendt's effort were to be strategic here, it's probably not the best idea to have the first chapter be about the fact that the Israeli court was too emotional and too concerned with the victims and not enough with Eichmann, and the second chapter trying to understand Eichmann and what he said and how he understood himself. And so, as she says in the judgment that I just read for you, he says a lot of things which she doesn't agree with, but she tries to take them somewhat seriously. You said you had never acted from base motives, right? She says we find that hard to believe. It's possible, but we don't know your motives, but we find that hard to believe. You say you could not have acted otherwise and you did not feel guilty. She says again, we find this difficult, though not altogether impossible to believe. So I guess what I'm saying, Mark, is that she does. There is a real effort here. I don't think only as an academic or an intellectual, but also as a matter of justice, to come back to the conversation we're having, to say that in a court of law, what we're really interested in is the accused. Did they do what they, in law we call, we have two things. I don't know if there's any other lawyers on here. This is my old lawyer hat. We have the actus reus and the mens rea. So the actus rea is the guilty act, and the mens rea is the guilty mind. Did Eichmann do a guilty act, right? Did he break a law, or did he do something guilty or wrong? And did he have a guilty mind or conscience when he did it? And in a typical criminal legal trial, those are the two questions that drive the inquiry. And what Arendt is saying, I think, when I say he's trying to take Eichmann seriously, she's trying to say, well, what's his guilty act? And what's his guilty mind? And she's trying to understand him. And I think that act of trying to understand Eichmann, especially at the beginning of the book, right, really turned a lot of people off. So this comes back to Susan's, point. Do we criticize Arendt for for the rhetorical way she writes the book. You can. I mean, I have I'm not going to tell you not to. I would say that I would say two things. One is I think we're still trying to understand what she said, not necessarily simply how she said it, although they interact with each other. But the second, I would be a little more controversial and say, I think she starts with this on purpose. Partly, as Johanna says in the chat, that she's going in order and she's trying to give what she calls a trial report. But the very fact that she's going in order and trying to give her trial report is because she's making a strong statement about what her idea of justice is. And it's dispassionate. It's taking him seriously. It's trying to ask about him and not about other things. And that's going to turn a lot of people off, and it has. But I don't, and if it turns you off, I think that's something you should, say and be aware of. That doesn't mean you shouldn't read the book, right? I mean, we can all read books we don't like the style of or the points of, but I think it is part of her point.
Roger, I'm sorry to talk so much, but I won't do this next week, I promise. But if you think of what she's setting up here, maybe because of her particular bias, it's like the kind of justice that an all-white jury would give in the South to a convicted or to an alleged black criminal. This is the kind of environment that you had in Israel at the time. Here is this person who, yes, participated in a horrific period and horrific crimes, but he's facing accusers who are totally their justice is a very tricky word here. It's and I think she sees that and she sets it up. And maybe that's what's so hard for people to take, because the immediate association of horror is the Nazis and is Eichmann. So we immediately assume that he's guilty. That was the assumption in that courtroom. There was no justice even contemplated. And I think she sets it up beautifully. And I think that the last bit that you read was very, very useful, because she does come to some sort of decision that I think is based on her concept of justice.
Could I say one more thing? I've been wanting to bring this up a little bit when you mentioned mens rea and actus reus. I mean, for him to say he didn't have any base motives, but I mean, the question with mens rea is, did you intend the expected consequences of your acts? I mean, you do certain things. Yeah. He had to know, right?
Yep.
That the consequences of his actions were going to produce murder.
Yeah, I mean,
it's not an abstraction.
No, I mean, but the question is, what was the guilty mind? I mean, we're gonna have a lot of time to talk about this, because part of the problem he's saying is, and Arendt makes this point, he was, to the extent that he was following the law, and he didn't always follow the law, so we'll get into that. But to the extent he was, you have a weird reversal or inversion here, where to act legally, you have to break the law, and to act, if you follow the law, you act guiltily, and so that was part of Eichmann's claim, is that I didn't have any desire to kill the Jews. I was simply following the law. Now, she doesn't fully believe that, and that's why she says, we find it almost impossible to believe, but okay, we'll at least entertain it. That's what she says in that bit that I just read. But that's his claim, and his claim is that his mind was not a guilty mind. So I mean, and given the fact that you had really, horrendous laws, guilty mind actually meant that you follow the laws, not that you break the laws. And that's the change that Arendt is interested in, and we'll spend a lot of time parsing in one of the chapters in the middle of the book.
Roger, it's Margaret
Yeah.
again. Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I was trying to think about how to situate what she's saying in the context of some other things we've read of hers. And in particular, I mean, I'm thinking back to, her critique of the philosopher who is not looking where they are, who is not looking where their foot is, who is not seeing the hole in front of them. And the whole notion that to think and to be in the world is not to be in somehow absolved from having any idea of oneself, what's going on. And seeing her view of Eichmann through that, it makes a lot of sense. One could say, I mean, in her descriptions of Heidegger, did Heidegger do what he did for the period he was in, the Nazi Party, in the university, out of some clear understanding of the ultimate results of every one of his actions, or some intent to have exactly those results? Or was it more to the point of her, what she would call an absence of thinking, to not have essentially connects? And it's whether or not that's in the context of the legal trial here, it seems such, from what we've read of hers, it seems such a clear of, this is what happens when you don't connect the dots, when the person is not situated in the world they live in, whether because they're blank upstairs or they're just lost in their philosophy of view upstairs.
No, that's really helpful, Margaret, and it's right. This book is written in 1963, or published in 1963. The Life of the Mind, which we had just read, for those of you who read it in the last semester with us, she frames it as the question of what is the purpose of, or what is thinking, and can thinking accomplish anything in the world, and her thesis is, or her hypothesis is, that thinking may be the one thing that can prevent us from doing evil. And her analysis of Eichmann precisely is that he was banal, which means that he did not think. So, I mean, to that extent, as we get into this book and we get into her reading of Eichmann and her, as we were talking about with Mark, taking Eichmann seriously, we're going to, I hope, put some substance on that bare bones skeleton of what it means to not think, which will, I hope, give us some insight into what it means for Arendt to think. He becomes, this is her analysis of him, is that he's someone who gets so lost in an ideological worldview, which he embraces and needs to believe in, and he gets caught up in cliches and justifications, that he, even though, and this she does give to him at the end, probably would not have become a criminal if he hadn't been born in and where he was and joined the Nazi Party when it did. He became a master criminal, and in fact, a horrific criminal who needs to be killed. And a lot of that is going to be because she thinks, not because he had some innate evil in him, not because he was like some Iago or some awful master, hater, but because he got caught up in a movement, and that he was able to do so because he was so banal and didn't think, couldn't see the world from the perspective of others, couldn't challenge the very ideas that he became wrapped up in. And so this book is, even though it's, as Patrick said, it's a book written for the New Yorker, and it's maybe a little easier, than some of the others. This book and her experience with Eichmann is deeply important for our understanding of her later thinking about thinking and evil and politics in general. So all of that will continue to play a role. Yeah. Go ahead.
Could I just bring up one other thing that we're again, getting into the philosophy of justice and so on. We haven't talked about the fact that the court didn't exist, Israel didn't exist, the crimes were not defined, and the punishments were not defined when he committed those crimes. So there's these monstrous crimes. So when you're talking about justice, you talk about the thing that's going on and the technicalities of the mens rea and mens. But the fact of the matter is, the location and the context of this seems to me hasn't been mentioned. I wish somebody would. Doesn't anybody think it's funny that you're taken to jail in a country you don't speak the language, no laws that you knew about or whatever, and you were kidnapped? So I just thought that we should mention something about that.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, sure. I'm sitting here and struggling, and when I get through with the session, the next 2 weeks, I'm going to go back and do some research. But you had the same thing under apartheid. You had a movement that murdered people, did horrible, horrible crimes, and then after South Africa comes to be an independent state, their response is to get a hold of the people who committed those crimes, precisely because of what you said, that these people were swept up in a movement. And even though they committed the crimes, South Africa took the position, and I have to go back and research it because it's been a long time since I read it, that they deserve reconciliation. And they set up a process where that could happen. And so when you talk about her concept of justice, maybe it's a little more narrow than we would do today.
Yeah. So thanks, Howard. That's an important point. I've written a lot about reconciliation in Arendt, and happy to share that with anyone who wants to see it. But basically, there's a couple things about the South African case that I'll point out. One is to warrant a reconciliation tribunal instead of a criminal tribunal. The people had to admit their guilt and confront their victims or the families of their victims, and in a sense be reintegrated back into the community in a kind of reconciliation. Arendt writes a lot about reconciliation, and it's a part of her work that I've been very interested in. And what she says about it is that in order to reconcile, we have the guilty party or the accused party has to admit their wrong, has to seek forgiveness in a certain way, or not forgiveness, admit their wrong and seek to be reintegrated into the community, and then the community has to make a judgment that person can be reintegrated into the community, that we can reconcile, not with the person, and this is an important distinction that Arendt makes, but with the deeds the person did. And she says that because it's important. We're not actually judging or reconciling with the mens rea, with the mental state. We're saying, can we in South Africa exist in a political community with those who did what they did if they ask for forgiveness and admit what they've done? And Arendt says that's a political judgment. that's a political judgment that we can form a common community with them. Now, in the case of Eichmann, what I argue is that Arendt says, forget his mental state, right? We don't know. It's unlikely we believe you, but forget it. The deeds he did, can we reconcile? Can we reintegrate someone like Eichmann back into civilized human community? And her answer is no. She says someone who actively worked, not just as a bureaucrat, and this is an important distinction that someone else earlier brought up. He wasn't just a bureaucrat. He actively worked to eliminate Jews, a whole race of people from the face of the earth, and other peoples, by the way, Roma and others. And she says, someone like that, to reconcile with them, is to say that we can live in a world in which those acts are reconcilable. And she says that for her, that she cannot do, which is why she thinks, and then she says that's the only reason you must die. We cannot reconcile with that. We obviously have no idea what she would think about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, which have been very popular and some people argue very successful. But South Africa continues to have a lot of issues and a lot of problems. I'm not sure where she would stand on and I think it might depend on the different criminals and what they've done. But I don't think that someone who actively worked to eliminate black people, black South Africans. Now, again, it wasn't a genocide in the same sense so it might be slightly different, but actively oppress and enslave an entire population based on race. I don't know where she would stand, but I would find that hard to reconcile with. I think people have different views on that, I don't think it's obvious that she would be in favor of reconciliation in the South African situation, which is not to say she's right. I'm just saying I don't think it's obvious at all. We have a couple minutes left. Any final comments?
Roger, I guess the thing I'm struggling with is that she's saying that this is his inability to think. And I guess given where we are right now, maybe it's too much of a leap, we're seeing people who it appears are capable of thinking but just don't care. And I guess I'm questioning that whole theory that this was the basis. He says he didn't feel guilty, and we're seeing this every day now, is people doing pretty horrible things and allowing pretty horrible things, and I think they think, but they don't care.
Do you have? I mean, are you talking about what? Can you put some specifics on what you're saying?
What's going on in the United States Senate, of people who are capable of thinking, and they're being given all kinds of facts, but they just don't care. And I think that there's evidence Eichmann was the same. He didn't care. He maybe could think. I mean, she says he couldn't think, and that was the issue. I'm questioning if that was the issue, given what we're seeing now.
Well, so just a few things. I mean, there's not that I'm aware of, a genocide going on and supported by the senators. It's a slight. I don't think it's a apples and apples comparison that you're making. And I don't want to litigate the impeachment hearings here. But I mean, I'm sure there are some people in the Senate who are, scared and cowardice and worried about what Trump might say to them in their reelection. I think I'll at least say I think there's a lot of people who think that what Trump did is wrong, but don't think he should be impeached for it. I mean, I don't see that as a radical or unthinking argument. I think that's actually I mean, it's an argument a lot of smart people have made, right? What he did was wrong, but there's almost no president in history who hasn't done similar things, and that the way to get rid of him is through an election, not through impeachment. So now the PR and the propaganda and the one-sidedness of it I mean, it's disgusting, and we can share that, but that's unfortunately what politics has become. But I don't think that someone who argues against impeachment is by definition thoughtless, if that's the point you're making.
I can speak. Sorry.
Can I add? Oh.
My name is Erica. Hi. I worked at the Department of Justice during the first 2 years of this administration, and will say that I read Eichmann in Jerusalem for the first time at the beginning of this administration, and then after I left in November, the description of Eichmann, I know the initial point was about impeachment, but as excuse making and kind of unwilling to engage with, we can call it Arendt's unthinking, but I saw it in part as a unwillingness to engage with the consequences of what was actually happening, was very much something I saw in the day-to-day of what we were doing, and just gave me a vocabulary that I found very useful in thinking about what was going on.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. I mean, I think that it's really important to draw some lines, and I think you just drew a really important one. The indictment of bureaucratic thoughtlessness that Arendt makes in this book, and maybe even more so in certain other books she writes or essays that she writes, is absolutely pertinent and meaningful to read in this day and age. The way that people can deflect responsibility for the actions they enable through their jobs or their bureaucratic roles is, in her mind, one of the if not the most dangerous event of the modern world. She calls bureaucracy the rule of nobody, the rule of bureaus, because no one is responsible. No one takes responsibility. Everyone just does their job and things happen. And then there's no one to protest against. There's no one to kick out of office. And the role of bureaus and the rule of bureaucracy, she says, is the cruelest and most horrific of rules, potentially. So in that regard, the thoughtlessness that one sees in someone like Eichmann, to the extent he's a bureaucrat, and its relevance for the modern world is profound, and we're going to speak a lot about it. The senators are different. They're not bureaucrats, we hope, although they may have become such. But I think we have to have a different critique of what they're doing, aside from just bureaucracy. But look, it's a great point, and we're going to have plenty of time to talk about it as we read through this book. So we're out of time today. Thank you all. We meet again, I think, in 2 weeks, which would be Friday the 7th.
February 7th.
Yeah. And we're reading what, Sam? The next 2 chapters or just 1 chapter? You know?
We are reading just the next chapter on Eichmann, I think.
Yeah. So this is an important chapter. It's her digging deep into his background and who he is. It could be tough reading for some of you. I understand that. So, I mean, in the sense that she's taking him seriously. But I encourage you to read it, and I look forward to talking with you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thanks very much.